Welcome back. So today we're going to be working with these two handouts. So the first one that we're going to work with is actually this one, the quadrilaterals doodle notes. And so this is going to go on page 60 of your notebook, page 60. And yes, I realize that we've skipped some pages, but just understand that I have some other pieces that are going to go in there that we want to keep together. So just know that this is going on page 60. Okay, so today we're going to be working with some basic quadrilaterals, just the parallelograms. So we're just going to be talking about some different things that we know about our parallelograms. So when we think about a parallelogram, we know that all parallelograms have to have two pairs of parallel sides. That's what makes it a parallelogram, is those two pairs of parallel sides. Okay, so then what are some other attributes that we know about our parallelograms? So opposite angles. What do we know about opposite angles? So when we're talking about opposite angles, we're looking at this one here and this one here. So for any parallelogram, those two angles are always going to be congruent. Congruent. We can say the same thing about the second pair of opposite angles, but this time, in order to mark that, I'm going to make two little arcs. Now the reason why I'm making two instead of just one is because I don't know that these are congruent to each other. I just know that opposites are congruent. So I need to show that there's a difference between the one on the right and the one on the left. Okay? Alright, so let's keep going here then. So now we're going to look at opposite sides. So we said that it has two pairs of parallel sides, so we can say that they are parallel. So we're going to mark that. So I'm going to put arrows on here. So arrows mean parallel. So I'm putting two little arrows on the top, two little arrows on the bottom, so that I can say that those two lines are parallel to each other. And then I'm just going to put one little arrow on the sides here to show that those are parallel to each other. Okay, so they are parallel to each other, and they are congruent. They are also congruent to each other. So let's go ahead and mark that as well. So I'm going to put little hash marks on here. Remember, we said those little hash marks mean congruent. So just like our angles, we put arcs to mean congruent. We put the little hash marks on our sides to mean congruent. Okay, so the next one here is diagonals. So we're actually going to draw the diagonals for this parallelogram. That means from opposite angle to opposite angle. So we're going to go ahead and mark those on our picture. So when we're looking at the diagonals, they're actually going to bisect. So what did bisect mean? So they're going to bisect each other. Bisect, we said, was cutting them in half. Okay, so if we cut them in half, that means each of those pieces are congruent to each other. So I'm going to mark this one with three little hash marks. Okay, because this segment here bisected this one. So these two pieces are congruent to each other. They're not congruent to the sides, they're congruent to each other. So that's why I used three, because I've already used one and two, so now we're at three. Now this one here has also been bisected, so I'm going to use four little hash marks, because these are congruent to each other, not to anything else necessarily, but to each other. Okay, so just bisect each other. And then the last one are consecutive angles. That means from here to here. Well, with our consecutive angles, they're actually supplementary. So that means when I add up the two consecutive angles, they're going to total 180. And consecutive means if we're going around clockwise or counterclockwise, it's the two angles that come one after the other. So if I'm going around clockwise from here to here, those two angles are going to be consecutive. From here to here, these two angles would be consecutive. From here to here, those two angles would be consecutive. And the same thing if I went around the other direction. Okay? So we're going to pause with this one for just a minute, and we're going to take a look at this other handout that I gave you. Now this handout is taking all these things that we just talked about and putting them into actual theorems. So we actually have a theorem that says if it is a parallelogram, then we know these things must be true. Okay, so we're actually going to go through and fill those in. So using this, we're going to fill in this piece. Okay, and this page is actually going to go on page 55 in your notebook. Remember I said we had some other things that were going to go in those missing pages? Well, this is the beginning of them. So we've got a bunch of theorems that we're going to talk about in these next couple sections, and we want to keep those all together because they're all about parallelograms. So we're going to kind of keep those all on pages 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59. We're going to keep those together there and have one central place to find them. Okay, so let's take a look here. So a parallelogram, we're dealing with opposite sides. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then, since this is the opposite side theorem, we're going to put opposite sides, and I'm going to abbreviate opposite sides. What do we know about those opposite sides? What did we say over here? Opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So this one, we're actually just going to use the congruency part. They are congruent. And I'm going to use that congruent symbol. Okay, that is our congruent symbol right there. And again, if you look over here at your picture, you can see our little hash marks. Those mean congruent. And then we also have our statement here telling us that PQ is congruent to RS. Okay, and we also have QR is congruent to SP. Good, let's move on to the next one then. So this one is opposite angles. So if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then the opposite angles, and I'm going to use my angle symbol, are, well, what do we know about opposite angles? Let's look over here. We just said that opposite angles are congruent. So we're going to put our congruency symbol in here again. So those are congruent to each other. Those are congruent to each other. And then we have an example down here, as well as the markings over here to the right. Okay? Great job. Let's keep going then. We have a couple more. So the next one says, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then this one deals with consecutive angles. So what do we know about our consecutive angles? We said consecutive angles are supplementary. Supplementary. So if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then it's consecutive, and I'm going to abbreviate again, consecutive angles are supplementary. Those are supplementary. So then here's a great example. If we have our parallelogram over here, then x plus y equals 180. X plus y, those are consecutives. We could also go counterclockwise. X plus y, those would be consecutive as well. They add up to 80 degrees. Okay, and then the last one, dealing with diagonals. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its diagonals do what? What did those diagonals do? So let's look over here. The diagonals bisect each other. So they bisect each other. Okay, and then we've got a marked on here. QM and MS are congruent. PM and MR are also congruent. Okay, because remember, bisecting means it cuts it into two equal parts. So they are congruent. And again, this goes on page 55 in your notebook. So these are our theorems. Okay, let's go back to this one now. Let's do a couple triads. So if you look over here on the right, we have triads. There's a parallelogram on this first one. So let's take a look at that one. It says find each missing angle measure. So this one tells us it's a parallelogram. So we know all this information has to be true since it's a parallelogram. They told us one of the angles is 90. So what do we know about the other angles? Well, let's look here. It says opposite angles are congruent. So if this one's 90, then this corner has to be 90. Okay? Now what about this one and this one? We don't know anything about those yet. See, opposite sides, that's not going to help us. We need angles. Diagonals, that's not going to help us. We need angles. Consecutive angles says they are supplementary. So consecutives means from here to this one. If I add those together, I'm going to get 180. 90 plus what would give me 180? Well, it has to be another 90 degrees. And then I know opposites are congruent, so this one would also be 90 degrees. Okay, so as simple as that. You're just going through these different properties and figuring out what those angle measurements are. So let's try another one of those. If we scoot down just a little bit here, we have another parallelogram. We don't know anything about our isosceles trapezoids yet. We'll actually fill in the trapezoid piece and do this one later on in 7.5. So we'll come back to that one. But today we're going to finish up with this last one here, the bottom one that's also a parallelogram. So it tells us here that this corner is 4x. Well, we know that opposite angles are congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and put 4x over here in this corner. And then we have x plus 5 up here in the top right. So I'm going to go ahead and put x plus 5 down here in the bottom right corner as well, because those have to be congruent also. So there's a couple different ways we can solve this one. The first one is we talked about the sums of the interior angles for polygons not too long ago. So for this one, it's a quadrilateral. So we know its sum is 360 degrees. So we could add up all four angles and set it equal to 360 degrees, solve for x, and then plug it back in to get our measurement. But I'm not going to do that because I have this new one that says consecutive angles are supplementary, or they equal 180. So I'm just going to do two angles and equal it to 180. So 4x plus our x plus 5 equals 180 degrees. So I'm going to combine my x's, so I get 5x plus 5 equals 180. Subtract my 5 from both sides. So I get 5x equals 175. So then from there, divide by 5 on both sides. We get x equals 35. Now I'm not done yet. I have to plug that back in. So 4 times 35 gives me 100. Well, if this one's 140, this one has to be 140. So I don't need to do that math again. I just need to transfer it down there. So then up here, we have x plus 5. So we've got 35 plus 5 equals 40. So this one's 40 degrees. Well, if the top one's 40, the bottom one also has to be 40. So now I'm going to check supplementary. Consecutives have to be supplementary, so 40 plus 140 is 180. So it does work. My opposites are congruent to each other. My consecutives are supplementary. So I know that my answers are correct. Okay, that's all we're going to do for this first one. I'll see you in class. Have a great day.